Hello again and welcome to another Warhammer 40k Mordy and Glory video. In today's episode, we're going to be continuing our musings on the meta, how we think that Guard and 40k as a whole might evolve over the course of the transition from 9th edition to 10th edition. In our last installment, we looked at Guard artillery and the plethora of indirect fire options that the Astra Militarum has available to it, and we considered how this might become the go-to way to play your Imperial Guard competitively. If you've not seen that episode, don't worry, I'll make sure to link it at the end of this one. But today we're going to be looking at something a little bit different. We're going to be focusing on vehicles. That's right, if there's one thing that Guard does well, it's our tanks. And I want to explore a new way that we can use our mechanized and armored armies. And so without further ado, let's mount up, roll out, and drive right into this video. So let's begin with the basics, especially for those who might be getting into 40k for the first time. What is a mechanized list? What's an armored list? And is there a fundamental difference between the two? At their core, they're pretty similar. They're all about vehicles and tanks. It's about putting as many armored fighting vehicles, as many main battle tanks into the field, and essentially overwhelming your opponent's anti-tank capabilities. If your opponent is prepared to take on a few transports, a few tanks, maybe a bit of infantry, a bit of this, bit of that, then they're not likely to have enough anti-tank to deal with it when you just turn up with a huge sea of vehicles. The big differences appear when you start looking at the kind of units in a mechanized list versus those in an armored, and also what the game plan is behind each army. For example, a mechanized list will have some heavy armor, some damage dealers. At most, perhaps 50% of the list will be dedicated towards things like Leman Russes and Rogal Dawns. Things that are just there to absorb a huge amount of punishment and throw it right back into your opponent's face. But the other half of the list, if not more, will consist of mechanized infantry. These are going to be things like your standard infantry squads, your Kading shock troopers, maybe more elite choices like your Kazakin and your Scions, and they are going to be mounted up inside of transports, be they Tauroxes, Chimeras, Taurox Primes, or maybe even Valkyries. Mechanized lists trade a significant part of their damage output to be able to play the game, to be able to do missions and to secure objectives, primary and secondary. They're a balance between going for pure damage output and also actually having a bit of tactical flexibility and a little bit of nuance. Armored lists are not so subtle. They are dedicated to one thing and one thing only: smashing your opponent in the face with as much brutal and unrelenting firepower as possible. After all, you don't need to worry about your opponent scoring victory points if your opponent is dead. Armored companies tend to consist of a fleet of main battle tanks, and it's not uncommon to see lists feature 9, 10, 11, or even 12 Leman Russes as pretty much their entire army. But that was then, and this is now. That was the past, and we need to look to the future. And we need to ask ourselves, is Leman Russ spam and heavy tank spam still viable? Unfortunately, I don't think it is anymore. And this is down to two things. Firstly, the points costs. Frankly, the cost of heavy tanks in this economy is just too high. You're looking at 200 points for a half decent Leman Russ. Sure, you can spend a little bit less, go down to 180 for an Eradicator, but that's often not going to get the job done. And if you want anything half decent like a Demolisher, you're looking at more than 200 points. On top of this, you've got tank commanders, which are now 240 points base. And if you want them to do more than one order, you're going to need to spend under 15 points on one of your tank commanders to get Grand Strategist. That's 255 points for one tank to support a couple of other ones. That is very, very low return on your investment. And speaking of orders, you've got the fact that orders don't splash anymore. Used to have a single tank commander could support a whole squadron of other Leman Russes. Not anymore. One order supports one unit. And everyone knows in the Guard, a unit without an order, whether it's a Russ or an infantry squad, really isn't doing all that much damage. You need orders to get your units to perform and to get them to punch well. Put it this way, there's nothing more depressing than seeing a 200 plus main battle tank fire every one of its guns, blaze away with its heavy bolters, its plasma, its heavy stubber, 500 kilo missile, and finally yeet a huge demolisher cannon shell into an opposing unit, and you just miss with everything because you can't roll 4 pluses to save your life, and you didn't have take aim to make the shots hit. And it's not just armored companies which are going to struggle in this regard. It's the same for mechanized units as well. Your principal firepower, the thing that was keeping your opponent busy whilst your mech infantry ran around getting the job done, was Leman Rusted. So does this mean that mech lists and armored lists are dead in 10th edition? Absolutely not. They just require a new way of thinking. In my opinion, the way to get your vehicle heavy lists working in 10th is through medium armor spam. Guard has access to some criminally undercosted units between the main index and Forge World. I'm talking lists that might feature 20 plus vehicles in them. For example, you've got Hellhounds. Now these are 125 points. That is 75 points cheaper than the average Leman Russ. But Morning Glory, I hear you say, Hellhounds are nowhere near as good as Russes, right? Well, depends how you want to judge them. In terms of pure firepower, then no. Of course, the Leman Russ has got a lot more weapons it can strap onto it. But in terms of durability, they're a lot closer than you think. Both vehicles have a 2 plus save. Now the Leman Russ does have toughness 11 and the Hellhound only toughness 10, but that actually counts for very little in 10th edition 40k. You see, a lot of common anti-tank weapons are strength 8 or strength 9. Think about your plasma, and your melter, and your autocannon, and your crack rockets, and their equivalents across other factions. Now, whether you're strength 8 or 9, it doesn't really matter when you're shooting toughness 10 or 11, because you're wounding both vehicles on a 5 plus. And when you flip it on its head and start looking at proper anti-tank, like, okay, well, let's look at las cannons. They're heavy anti-tank. Okay, well, a las cannon shooting into a Leman Russ with its strength 12 is wounding the Russ on 3s. But it's also only wounding the Hellhound on 3s as well. So the toughness doesn't really matter. The only main difference between the two is the fact that Russ has got 13 wounds and the Hellhound's only got 11. Now that does matter for things like damage 2 and damage 3 guns, because it means that in either case, the Leman Russ takes an extra successful shot through to kill the vehicle. But is that extra one shot worth even a portion of that 75 points? I'd argue it's not a huge deal when you take into account that you could get a Hellhound and a Hydra, and you would only be spending the same amount of points as you would be on a single Leman Russ demolisher. Suddenly, that firepower difference isn't all that much. You've got 200 killers, you've got the 4 autocannon shots with twin linked, and you've got the Inferno cannon, and you've got the heavy flamer on the Hellhound, and you've got a heavy bolter on the Hydra. Suddenly, the firepower difference isn't all that much. And actually, the toughness, you could argue, is now way in the favor of the medium armor, because you've got 2 vehicles. So the toughness doesn't matter, and now you're bringing more wounds to the table for the same points cost. And this is the key to the new 10th edition armored doctrine. It's all about the most bang for buck. It's all about as many armored hulls as you can get, and it's all about taking advantage of the new toughness that GW has given to our tanks. So now that we understand the principle, how do we execute it? What are the best units to make this happen? Well, you've got your classics like your Hellhound. They are your quintessential guard medium armor. We also mentioned you've got things like Hydras, which pack a surprising amount of firepower onto a cheap frame. You can't forget your artillery, but we've mentioned those before in the previous video. I think for the main guard index, another area you're really going to want to consider is Sentinels. Sentinels bring a lot of firepower and durability in a relatively affordable package. Don't forget your Sentinels have got a better save than ever before. Scouts are onto a 3+ save now, and your Armor Sentinels are on a 2+ save. You can really create just a wall of 2+ armor between Armor Sentinels and Hellhounds. And they're all bringing brilliant abilities to the table. Your Hellhound is going to remove cover, your Scout Sentinels are going to be giving you reroll 1s, and your Armor Sentinels are getting full rerolls thanks to their Tank Hunter capability. But I think the thing that's going to bring this all together, the real hidden gem, the jewel in the crown, is going to be Forge World. Because in those indexes are some very cheap armored units. Obviously, I'm not talking in real world money. They're very expensive, but 3D printers, recasters, those things are available. It'd be remiss of us not to acknowledge their existence. And if you can get your hands on some Forge World units, you might just make this armored 10th edition thing work. I'm talking about flyers. I'm talking about the fact that flyers are no longer limited by the rule of 2. You can take as many as you want. And they're really cheap. A Avenger Strike Fighter, which comes with las cannons and with an Avenger Gatling cannon, so it can take on tanks and it can take on infantry, no problemo, is 130 points. It's the same cost as a Hellhound, yet it brings to the table something the Hellhound doesn't. Proper anti-tank punch. Don't need to rely upon those Armored Sentinels when you can take a good old Avenger Strike Fighter. And what about the Lightning? That thing's packing even more anti-tank capabilities. It's got las cannons and it's got Hellstrike rockets. Now, the downside to these flyers are they are only T9. So I would consider them light medium armor. They're kind of on that cusp, right? They're not quite as light as the Sentinel, but they ain't as chunky as a Hellhound. But T9 is definitely something you need to take into account. But on the plus side, they do have 14 wounds each, which is actually more than a Lehman Russ. And in the case of the Voss Pattern Lightning, they come with their own inbuilt -1 to hit. These extra wounds and the -1 to hit make the Lightning, in my opinion, the most interesting choice and definitely more than viable to include in your army list. And another thing to consider about these flyers, I could be wrong about this though. Before I go any further, I want to say if you know better than me, I'm still learning 10th edition, let me know down in the comment section. Please correct me. But I believe flyers are kind of like pseudo towering. They're kind of like pseudo indirect fire. They don't care about ruins blocking line of sight. They just use true line of sight to determine what they can see. And that means that if we're entering this age of L-shaped ruins, of competitive play and people being able to hide a lot of their army, having access to flyers might just be key. Because the more ways that you can get into your army to see those hidden enemy units, the better. Now, up until this point, we focused on what I would call damage dealers, support units who bring a lot of guns onto the table. But what about playing the mission? What about your battle line, your bread and butter, your mechanized infantry in transports? Well, good news, because they've also got stronger in 10th. Not only have your Chimeras gone from T7 to T9, which makes them pretty durable against things like autocannons and crack rockets. Not as durable as the Lehman Russ, but still tougher than they were in the previous edition. But they also now have access to firing deck. And I believe that Chimeras with firing deck are brilliant. Really, really strong. If you take a Chimera and you give it double heavy bolter and a heavy stubber on top and a hunter killer, and then you stack a unit in the back, it could be a heavy weapon squad with a pair of las cannons and a spare third weapon, whatever you might want that to be, or just an infantry unit, just the classic infantry squad in a Chimera, you're going to end up with a unit that's going to put out 6 heavy bolter shots with sustained hits, potentially 6 heavy stubber shots thanks to the new rapid fire 3, and a hunter killer round, and 12 lasgun shots, and out of the back you could be seeing a crack grenade and an autocannon or a las cannon. All of that firepower, all of that DACA, much of which is damage 2 or higher, for 150 points. I don't mean to alarm you, but you could take that 6 times and it would cost you less than 1,000 points. In fact, what would a mechanized list look like? Let's just chuck one together off the top of my head. You could take 6 Chimeras, you could add in 3 squads of 3 Scout Sentinels. Literally can't go wrong with that. They're going to bring reroll 1s to the party, they're going to bring Lance Cannons, they're going to bring Hunter Killers. And then on top of that, why don't we just chuck in 3 of those sweet lightnings that we talked about? You add all of that together, you're looking at 1,740 points for 18 armored vehicles, all with a 3+ save and a shitload of wounds between them. And loads of firepower, and can actually play the mission. Because you've got Battle Line, you've got OC for days. And what about those armored lists? What if we just go for damage dealing? Well, we could take 3 Lightnings, 3 Avenger Strike Fighters, 3 Hellhounds, 3 Hydras, and 3 squads of 3 Scout Sentinels, and all of that comes to 1890 points. You could probably squeeze in another vehicle of some point if you wanted to, or maybe consider taking a character. Either way, you're looking at 22 armored vehicles for less than 2,000 points. Okay, so I have to be honest with you, I'm not 100% sold on that last list. Like I said at the beginning of the video, you kind of need to have orders to make your guard do what they're going to do, but it is a hell of a lot of armor, and you can kind of always push something to its extreme so it kind of breaks those traditional rules. It might just be crazy enough that it works, but even if it doesn't, you've got plenty of wiggle room there. You don't need 22 armored vehicles. You could take a few out, you get yourself down to 15, 16, 17, and instead put a few officers in there to really make the army sing. The point is that however you look at this, guard armor is very affordable right now. It's very cheap and it's very spammable. And this is going to give you lots of different tools in the toolbox. You could consider everything we've talked about today from purely a mechanized and an armored perspective, but there's a lot of things that could be translated over into hybrid guard as well. If you're playing right now and you're thinking, man, these Russes just don't seem to be doing enough for how much I'm paying for them, and I don't feel like I'm getting a lot into my list because 800 points is being taken up by 3 or 4 vehicles, then just try something a bit different. Think about taking that medium armor. Think about trying to get more stuff onto the table. Because at the end of the day, the guard is a horde army, and it might just be that we're entering a new edition and we need to think in new ways to unlock our true potential. Of course, all of this is just like my opinion, man. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Do you think that armor doctrine is going to shift towards medium armor, or is there still a place for those heavy main battle tanks? If you enjoyed today's video, make sure you smash that like button and also subscribe to never miss an episode. And if you found today's video particularly enjoyable or informative, then please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon. By supporting the channel, you'll be helping me create content, but at the same time, you will also unlock a whole host of perks for you to enjoy. The biggest of which is access to the Mordy and Glory Discord server, an online community with almost 2,000 active members. It's always popping off in the MG Discord. We've got channels for discussing tactics, hobbying, painting, and even a pretty spicy meme section as well. And I just want to take a moment to say a big thank you to all of the latest channel members. So thank you to Default Username, Edwin J, Jack Finley, Duke Ronald, Billy, Rick Music, Nick Berry, Kevin Nelson, Sam Zarski, Necker Loves Cake, Alex Rodriguez, Robin Burt, Strix, Johnny 5, Alexander Berg, Ben Hogan, Stephen, Admiral Galactica, Bass Browser, Neuromancer, Duca 15, Milo Moran, Uncle Buck, Nate, Bryson Lay, Toby K, Greg Heist, Christian E, Mass Produce Me, Lowly Strategos, Victor Von Snazdacker, Richard Eric Roth, Brandon Hutchings, Nathaniel Duncan, Midash Guy, Dadum, Hot Cup of Joe, Alexandra Brunn, Wilson Marquis, Monsoir, Geezer, Duffsnick, Julian Calero, James Riddle, Radioactive Bear, Ross Shaw, Tech 910, Rob Gailey, 40 Hitter, DB, Anders Morkberg, Colvier, Garin Fick, Razor 667, Miguel Perez, Peter Cronin, HPMV110, Eric McCombs, Iku Turso, An Innocent, Joe, Alec Trupps, Aid K, Mr. Baxter, Old Goat 1776, Callum McCaig, Unlisted Uniform, Morgan Rudolph, Alan Chapman, Tensler, and Couch Potato. I also want to do a big shout to the latest Patreons as well. So thank you to Jordan Freeman 94, Amy DeSweet, Aegis, Jamin Bales, Historicrane, James Lowry, Ken Starr, Reef Marley, Hannah B888, Jackson Ashworth, Metus Midman, Kelly and Chris Malink, Plastic Fork, Mike Galvin, and Miss Rogue Merc. And last, but certainly not least, I want to say a personal, special, heartfelt thank you to all of my top tier Patreon supporters. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the Call of Duty. So a massive thank you to Alan Blunt III, Amy DeSweet, Bon Bon Vert, Ken Starr, Mark Panconi, Ross Miller, Sawfish Trombone, John Stubbs, Diesel Fox, and August Varney. Thank you guys. Your ongoing and incredibly generous support makes a huge difference and is a big part of how I'm able to do Mordian Glory full time. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. Thank you for watching, and of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.